Taylor Swift is the ghost who haunts herself across her 11th studio album, The Tortured Poets Department. Across almost every song, she hears the sound of her younger voices whispering in other rooms, their phantom fingers playing familiar notes on the keyboard. Some of these familiar notes are literal. Pieces of Guitar and Robin, the ending of Champagne Problems leading into Chloe or Sam or Sophia or Marcus, the ending of Fresh Out the Slammer leading into You Are in Love. Others are more half-remembered faces in the grocery line. My Boy Only Breaks His Favorite Toys and I'm Gonna Get You Back sound like 1989 and Reputation Vault tracks respectively, whereas Fortnite and the title track both sound like cuts from Midnights. But Daddy I Love Him and I Can Fix Him turn back to Taylor's country roots, while the rest of the anthology essentially closes out this unofficial folk noir trilogy. Not for nothing have people called this a biblically accurate Taylor Swift album. It's worth noting, too, that the word anthology, when applied to singular poets, usually refers to works collected from across their entire bibliography. Ghosts don't just echo, though. They move things around, too. Sometimes violently, a slammed door, a smashed vase. Sometimes subtly, disappearing the car keys you'd swore you left on the counter, pushing the furniture an inch to the left. These moves create dissonances within the person haunted, a gap between what is experienced and what is known. If you aren't familiar with this album, you're going to be very lost very soon. But in broad strokes, The Tortured Poets Department is about Taylor Swift leaving her long-term relationship with British actor Joe Alwyn, who I will be calling the Blue Muse, for unfunny podcast guest Maddie Healy, who I will be calling the Rekindled Flame Muse. Flame Muse ends up ghosting her, leaving Taylor to process her grief alone and all at once. Grief at her relationships ending, at the struggles of fame, and at her own lost girlhood. I'm going to refer to Joe and Maddie with these code names for two reasons. One, to keep the focus of my analysis on the narrative functions they serve within the album. And two, because there are places on the album where the muse most of the fandom assigns to a song just doesn't line up with reality. Don't worry, we'll get to it. To give a brief roadmap of this essay, I'm going to explore how Taylor Swift performs trauma on the Tortured Poets Department. When I say performs, I don't mean that her trauma is performative, as in fake, or that she's being necessarily hyperbolic, although she has described the standard version of the album as such. Rather, I think the album performs trauma the way one might perform in a play or a film, and as in those mediums, silences and things left unsaid can say just as, if not much more, than spoken words. Additionally, I'm going to focus a lot on what biblical scholar George M. Landis calls textual gaps, where a piece of information has been intentionally or unintentionally omitted, and so presents some kind of interpretive issue for the reader. A dissonance, a word I'm going to be running into the ground in this essay, so just FYI, is a subtype of gap. Through the lens of trauma theory, all the album's little weird quirks and gaps, like the ambiguous muses, a track list that can swing wildly from one mood to the next, seeming misunderstandings of basic biblical texts, and even Taylor presenting herself as this alternate version of Jesus if he was a massive flop who couldn't even be crucified correctly. Believe it or not, they all begin to make sense. As a disclaimer, I'm not a therapist, just someone who enjoys studying psychology in my free time. I've listed my sources in the description, so if anything I say interests you, then I highly suggest that you check that out and come to your own conclusions. Additionally, while I think trauma theory is the most productive lens for analyzing this album, I was coming up with alternative theories for several different songs as I was writing the script, so I'm definitely not claiming to have solved the album for good. Finally, I'm going to give a trigger warning for discussions of predatory age gaps, toxic relationships, harassment, suicide, self-harm, the pandemic, and the Holocaust, with mentions of rape and murder just thrown in there for good measure. A lot of scholars only became interested in trauma after the World Wars, especially World War II, so I mean it is what it is. Furthermore, talking about all these different kinds of trauma is not to make a one-to-one comparison between any of them, but to discuss the underlying psychic processes that turn an event into a trauma, or an echo of a trauma, rather than just some shitty thing that happened to you. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's just jump right in. Frequent Rolling Stone writer Rob Sheffield had this passage in his latest book, Heartbreak at the National Anthem, How Taylor Swift Reinvented Pop Music, where he says that, in Taylor's constant pursuit of emotional and artistic reinvention, she leaves her old Taylors behind, but she never really gives up on any of them. She takes them all along with her, which is why listening to her albums often feels like eavesdropping on them while they argue. They're all a little needier than they want to be. They get jealous of each other. One of the songs he mentioned in this chapter is 7, where Taylor indulges in nostalgia for her early childhood, something she'll later dismiss on Tortured Poets as just a mind's trick. Nostalgia for childhood and childlike things is woven throughout Tortured Poets, yet the comfort they provide is always short-lived, a construct, as she herself admits. To me, this embodies the project of Tortured Poets, by which I mean the emotional or intellectual work I think Taylor wanted to accomplish by producing it. Tortured Poets does a lot of things, but above all, it is the unveiling and unraveling of her favorite construct, her entire mythology around love, to uncover the true reason why she feels stuck in a cycle of relational and self-destruction. In this chapter, then, I'm going to try and sketch some of the broad relational dynamics on Tortured Poets and their connections to other albums in her discography, particularly Red. First, however, we need to talk about Midnights. That the project of Tortured Poets is a continuation of that of Midnights is evidenced in the very first track. I was supposed to be sent away, but they forgot to come and get me. This line directly answers the question posed by Hits Different, the final non-remix track of the Midnights Till Dawn edition. Is that your key in the door, or have they come to take me away? The goal on Midnights was seemingly to unpack why her past relationships had failed in order to course correct with her current one. This project, however, was unsuccessful. Her 6-year relationship ended, and the track she released explaining her side of the breakup was clearly never intended to see the light of day, being as it A, was sold first as a CD exclusive in a New Jersey parking lot, and B, essentially revised several songs on Midnights into Coat Post, Rippin' Pizza Lavender Haze stands. The lead-up to Tortured Poets doubled down on this by hitting the Lavender Hazagon again, and placing it and several other very tender love songs on the Denial/I Love You, It's Ruining My Life Apple playlist. So clearly, even Taylor herself views Midnights, at least in part, as a failed cope. The central reason for this failure, or rather incompleteness, as I think that's a better description of what's going on here, lies in Taylor not only lionizing her partner's lack of interest in her melancholia, but shifting all the blame and responsibility for the relationship's health onto herself. It's me. Hi, I'm the problem, it's me. Yeah, kind of like that. Even The Great War, which gets close to giving her Blue Muse some amount of blame, still places the onus on herself to, quote, call off the troops, saying she's the one who was spineless and tore your banners down. Not that I think Taylor was a perfect angel in this relationship, but self-hatred has a very alluring aspect to it that not a lot of people seem to realize. If everything is your fault because you're a big old pile of shit, that means everything is technically within your control too, and that perceived everything frequently includes other people's reactions. You're Losing Me unveils the true nature of this dynamic, but again, it was not supposed to be part of the story we heard. So now I arrive at Tortured Poets, the song this time, not the album. My first attempt at capturing my thoughts on this song was late at night, tapped furiously into my phone. Tortured Poets, the song, is interesting in the context of none of them even scratched the surface of me. Well, yeah, that tends to be what happens when you pick a partner you secretly think is beneath you. There's a whole lot to unpack in that statement, so allow me to lay some groundwork. To start, my pithiness was inspired by Heidi Prieb's excellent video, The Real Reason Why Most Anxious Avoidant Relationships Fail and How to Combat It, wherein she details how many people with insecure attachment styles enter into relationships with unconscious premises that eventually doom them. One of these common premises is that your partner is not truly your equal. They're too passive, or they're not as smart as you, or not as mature or responsible. Although you consciously want a safe, secure, functional relationship, part of you enjoys a level of power over your partner, a power which in turn shields you from true vulnerability. Those of you who consume too much What Your Avoidant Ex is Thinking content like me might have heard of this idea of a relationship contract before. If you haven't, the concept originates with Clifford Sager, who in 1976 published Marriage Contracts and Couples Therapy, Hidden Forces in Intimate Relationships, wherein he theorized that each person brings a set of conscious and unconscious desires and expectations to a relationship. So like, if I do some of the chores and I make a lot of money at work, you're going to initiate sex with me on whatever I deem to be a regular basis. Or if I suppress my true personality and give you love and affection, you'll behave in a way that will win me the approval of my parents. No, I didn't tell you any of this stuff. You should have just known it, obviously. Sometimes these contracts would be pretty reasonable if said out loud, other times not so much. If I were to summarize a lot of the contracts depicted in Taylor's work, but especially on Tortured Poets, it would be, If I help you reach your full potential, you'll be grateful to me, you give me the love and understanding I desire, and grant me power over fate. So, again, pretty easy stuff. Multiple songs on Tortured Poets explore this concept, from the narrator of I Can Fix Him saying that not even God can fix a muse like she can, to the title track having the narrator be insistent that, despite them being two idiots, she and the muse are meant to be, and that no one else can decode them like she can. The entire concept of reclaiming one's childhood is another example of this, but I'll get to that one more in a minute. The question, of course, becomes where this contract came from. There are multiple reasons why Taylor might feel this way, but to start, I think the patriarchal structure of heterosexuality can't be discounted. As John Berger says in Ways of Seeing, men survey women before treating them. Consequently, how a woman appears to a man can determine how she will be treated. To acquire some control over this process, women must contain it and interiorize it. That part of a woman's self, which is the surveyor, treats the part which is the surveyed, so as to demonstrate to others how her whole self would like to be treated. And this exemplary treatment of herself by herself constitutes her presence. Every woman's presence regulates what is and is not permissible within her presence. Every one of her actions, whether it's direct purpose or motivation, is also read as an indication of how she would like to be treated. If a woman throws a glass on the ground, this is an example of how she treats her own emotion of anger, and so of how she would wish it to be treated by others. This leads in songs like Mastermind and The Balter to Taylor or the Taylor proxy narrator using control over the dynamic of a relationship as a way of regaining power.
You see, all the wisest women had to do it this way. 'Cause we were born to be the pawn in every lover's game. He was a cat, wanted her back, just like any good trophy hunter. She liked the way he tastes, taking him fair, making him care, watching him jump and pulling him under.
Copying what she thinks of the playbook of all the wisest women, Taylor the narrator turns the would-be trophy hunter into the hunted, using his emotional investment in her to her advantage. Interestingly, pulling him under leads directly into a scene of the two lovers on a boat, recalling the opening scene of the narrator nearly drowning, suggesting that she is trying to regain control over her fate by enacting it on others and making them take her place. This is not to touch on how Mastermind directly links her 5D mind chessing to her rejection by her peers as a small child, with social deaths transforming into near literal death as the idea evolves from one track to the next. Now, you may be wondering how Tortured Poets the song relates to avoidant supermodels like the Balter, and the answer is that by positioning herself as the self-sacrificing caregiver within the relationship, Taylor the narrator subtly places an emotional wall between herself and her lover. Taking care of others shifts the focus away from the narrator, giving her a sense of power over her partner while attempting to avoid direct vulnerability. It's worth noting that despite both narrator and muse claiming that they're going to kill themselves if their partner leaves, these declarations are made not to each other, but to outsiders. The song even opens with her undermining her muse's artistic pretenses before she laughs right in their face during the chorus. Although she calls the both of them idiots and crazy, she also sees the muse's cyclones as yet another episode to a show she's seen before, and wonders if they are going to screw things up with her, indicating she thinks of them as the more unstable one. The question of who else will hold or know the muse like her is one answered by herself. This ain't a duet. The unspoken message underneath the narrator's assertions, however, is that no one else would put up with the muse's bullshit, so they better be grateful. As well as contracts, this song illustrates two lovers with different ideas of their relationship's shared fantasy. The muse wants them to be a bohemian power couple, but the narrator rejects this. Again, although insulting herself attempts to soften the blow, the premise that they aren't Dylan and Patty because they're two idiots implies the muse was idiotic to think this. I mean, after all, they needed it pointed out to them. The term shared fantasy is credited to Fred Sanders' 1989 article, Shared Unconscious Conflicts, Marital Disharmony, and Psychoanalytic Therapy. As Sanders describes it, the shared fantasy is the acting and reenacting of repressed childhood traumas, fears, and desires. The calamities of childhood lead to the repetition with important others, who reciprocally enact similar or complementary unconscious conflicts. Sander acknowledges Sager as one of the many theorists who have already recognized the collusive element of dysfunctional marriages. But as far as I can tell, Sager's work is limited to the expectations one has for their role in the relationship and the benefits they should receive therein. What Sander brings here is the idea of self-destructive, or as he calls it, masochistic contracts. So, for example, if one person in their relationship hates themselves, they may unconsciously push their partners away and attempt to get their partners to leave. Or they might pick a partner that they know is running a liquidation sale, the red flags factory. Whatever the case may be, they are using the relationship as an elaborate form of self-harm. So there's this album called Red. If Midnights is a sister text to Tortured Poets, Red is the mother. Maybe not like full mom, but that sister that's like 8 or so years older than you, so she ends up being kind of positioned as a second mom alongside being a sister. The point is, the Red saga is important here too. At the 2022 Tribeca Film Festival, speaking on her short film for All Too Well, Taylor says, "I think there's a moment when you're 19 or 20 where your heart is so susceptible to being broken, getting shattered, and your sense of self goes out the window. I wanted to tell that story about girlhood calcifying into this bruised adulthood." The storyline of the Flame Muse on Tortured Poets is not just one of her being ghosted by her rebound, but of her becoming obsessed with someone from her past and building up a specific fantasy of that relationship in her mind to cope with her then current reality. In the greater context of the album, the shared fantasy of the rekindled Flame Muse ends up having little to do with the actual Muse themselves, and everything to do with a version of Taylor that she wishes she could have back.
Are you for real?
What do you mean?
I don't know, I just feel like maybe I made you up.
Additionally, the wounding depicted in the album Red is not simply being taken advantage of by an older man, but the seeming inauguration of Taylor's new outlet for her childhood feelings of ostracization, self-sacrificing within her romantic relationships. Let's start with this second point and then work our way out. Something I've always found interesting about songs like All Too Well is her mind reading the Muse. The whole business with the scarf, lines like "back before you lost, the one real thing you've ever known," etc. Taylor's not the first and certainly not the only person to do this in their songs, but I always read these bits as wishful thinking. The narrator, in order to shift the burden of memory from herself onto her Muse, needs to assert that he is the one who lost out on her. The jabs at him for taking advantage of their age gap on the 10-minute version further undermine her grab at importance. "I'll get older, but your lovers stay my age" could of course be read as him trying in vain to replace her, kind of like the line, "If she's got blue eyes, I will surmise that you'll probably date her on Is It Over Now?" But in reality, it's just further proof that she isn't special. Just between us, did the love affair maim you too? Is a question without an answer from the one person whose answer would actually mean anything. The manuscript seems to be where this full awareness sets in, as the Muse of that song looks at her license, potentially to prove that she's of legal age, before making a quip that has her calling him a professional. He denies this, of course, but the idea of his flirtations being pre-practiced has now implanted in the listener's mind. The lines, "when your impressionist paintings of heaven turned out to be fake," and "all at once the ink bleeds" in LOML also hinted this idea. An impressionist painting is meant to be done in the moment, capturing the painter's perspective of the landscape or object. If the paintings are bleeding ink, that suggests that they're printed. Truthfully, I envision this as him downloading some images off of Google search and then printing them off at like Office Depot or something. However, songs like Forever Winter on the Red Vault introduce another aspect to this, that being the taking on of the Muse's burdens, which will become a recurring theme in many other songs. The narrator expresses guilt over not realizing the extent of her lover's issues and is scared to death that he will leave if she's unable to defuse the bomb in his head. Her voice in the song goes from begging to screaming before attempting to wrap the song up nicely by her merely saying that she won't leave him. She calls him at all hours of the night to find him in a fit, just checking up on him, as she says, but why would you need to check in on someone at like 3 a.m., girl? Echoes of this dynamic come back in Taylor's use of war metaphors. She was fighting in only her Muse's army. She would sit with them in the trenches. She's a soldier returning half her weight. She kept calm and carried the weight of the rift. This, beyond being near cope, is why she insists that the Red Muse's demons all look like her. No one would share those emotional burdens if they didn't care deeply for someone, right? Ironically, the parallels between the lines, "I pull at every thread trying to solve the puzzles in his head," and "'cause I fit too right, puzzle pieces in the dead of night," the only other instance of the word puzzle in her entire discography, might I add, suggests that her attempting to help her Muses is what drives him away, because he's scared of being too vulnerable, or because he's scared of having to take responsibility. In another bitter, ironic twist, the guy who spends most of his nights wishing it was how it used to be has now cursed the girl to do much the same, replaying this relationship cycle over and over in an attempt to correct the past. I think an important contrast can be made here between the Dear John muse and this fuller picture of the Red Muse relationship. Although songs like Better Man displayed the Red Muse as blowing hot and cold with the narrator, Dear John and his sequel Would've, Could've, Should've displayed that muse as being more straightforwardly predatory. Even the more warm and loving song Ours has the Dear John muse triangulating the narrator with disapproving others, ghosts lurking about with lip-gloss smiles and thick-headed fathers. Triangulation of this nature bypasses true vulnerability between lovers, replacing it instead with an us versus them mentality that paints the instigator as a victim in need of rescue, a veneer of vulnerability, an impressionist painting made of cheap ink and copy paper. Although the narrator of I Bet You Think About Me has a lot to say about her ex-lover's friends, it doesn't seem like intentional triangulation. I mean, even in the All Too Well short film, he's not using these others to convince her that their love is more unique and special than the world's fit to understand. He's just ignoring her. We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together alludes to him trying to recruit his and her friend groups to get her back, but this element is not further explored, seeming to affirm that triangulation was not as significant a factor as it was with the Dear John muse. This is an important distinction to make, I think, because in the former, there's seemingly less space for the shared fantasy in both meanings of the word, less ways for the narrator to have her needs met, and less ways to turn her head and envision a world in which things could have gone right. The Dear John muse being more straightforwardly sinister and cynical doesn't lessen the narrator's trauma, far from it, but it makes it a bit easier for her to detach from the shared fantasy and no longer desire to be with the person. You would have been the one if you were a better man, on the other hand, leaves unspoken the question of, why wasn't I good enough for you to want to change? Although songs like Better Man and I Bet You Think About Me center the blame on the Red Muse, even portraying him as beyond help in the latter's case, this aspect of her wound forms the reverse side of the Balters portrait, self-betrayal masquerading as self-empowerment, attempting over and over to show her muses how worthy of love she is because of how much she's overflowing with it. Or, as Taylor describes love in the Long Pond studio sessions,
who would you be sad with? And who would you deal with when they were sad? And like gray skies every day for months, would you still stay?
Just as Taylor the narrator has to play 6D table mind tennis to ensnare her lover, so too must she endure endless gray in order to keep them around. It's how she would want to be treated, yes, but she also isn't fully convinced that she deserves better. In this way, we could also argue Maroon represents not only a revisiting of the Red Saga on Midnights, but a growing awareness that a certain once golden love is looking a little too red in the dying sunlight. But it would have been such a good story if they could just get it right. I mean, come on, admit it. Of course, as Taylor herself knows, an integral part of any good story is not just a string of exciting plot beats, but a sense of causality between them. As evidenced by songs like Fresh Out the Slammer and Guilty as Sin, her initial limerence for the rekindled flame muse is born from a bone-deep boredom and years of labor, locks, and ceilings. In other words, it was an escapist fantasy that became an escape route. A similar story appears on the song Getaway Car. But why would she need a reason, especially now? Half of this is certainly her audience, but I think the repetition of Am I Allowed to Cry on Guilty as Sin holds the other half. Without a clear reason for ending the relationship, I mean, sure, he's with a different her in dreams, but she's with someone else on her own at this point. How can she face the reality that the invisible string she saw running through their past was fake? Especially when song after song has pinned all the relationship's problems on her. It's worth noting that limerence like what is described on Tortured Poets is usually a response to an unbearable life. When life is, to borrow a phrase from Snow on the Beach, emotionally abusive, then it's quite common for your brain to latch onto people and spin these addicting fantasies about them just to give you any reason to keep going. It's not for nothing that Taylor compares being ghosted to being forced into opioid withdrawal on songs like The Smallest Man Who Ever Lived. And perhaps there's another element to this too. Am I allowed to cry if I should have seen this coming? That Taylor is dressing up this rekindled flame muse to justify leaving, both to herself and to her audience, is evidenced directly in LOML with lines like We embroidered the memories of the time I was away, stitching We Were Just Kids, Babe, and indirectly in Fresh Out the Slammer with lines like At the park where we used to sit on children's swings, wearing imaginary rings, or even the title track, But I've Seen This Episode and Still Love the Show. Even though she repeats that she and the rekindled flame muse are idiots, she still sees their relationship as a television show, a scripted thing. Rachel Fader and Tiffany Tatro, authors of Taylor Swift by the Book, also point out that despite Taylor saying she's not Patti Smith, she repeatedly references the title of Patti Smith's memoir, Just Kids. which documents her relationship with photographer Robert Mapplethorpe, to the point that they suggest the book as a sister text for tortured poets. Even though she's trying to deny it, Taylor sees the appeal of being a bohemian artist couple and yearns for her life to imitate their art. However, not only are they not Dylan Thomas and Patti Smith, they aren't actual childhood loves either. Although Taylor constantly invokes this idea of a childhood love, it's not real. Calling them children's swings strongly suggests that the two lovers were not children at the time. The sweater that the narrator Fortnite wears recalls Betty's cardigan, but the refrain saying their affair lasted only 2 weeks makes her less than August. Even Peter the character, if we read that song as being about the rekindled flame, which is a heavy if, but we'll put a pin in that for now, is not a child when he promises the narrator that he'll return for her. He's 25, and sure, plenty of older people call their 20 selves kids, but that's still different from being an actual child. A relationship between two children who grow up together is leaks from someone who's emotionally immature, but still legally an adult, and whose frontal lobe is about to pop in like a Lego block any second. That Taylor deeply desires a real childhood friends-to-lovers relationship is scattered throughout her discography, from Mary's song on debut to It's Nice to Have a Friend on Lover, and even the music videos for Everything Has Changed and Willow, which both feature child selves. This, of course, raises the question of why Taylor would find the idea of a childhood-adjacent love so appealing. Throughout her discography, Taylor's idea of love is equated with being understood and seen for who she truly is. Taylor Swift the person, not Taylor Swift the brand. And understandably so. This is stated directly on songs like Delicate, but appears in childhood love form on songs like Dorothea and 'Tis the Damn Season from Evermore. These songs are fictional, yes, but still equate the childhood love with true authenticity, as opposed to the so-called friends in LA who are just waiting to capitalize on the relation. One of Taylor's unreleased songs from the debut era even casts herself as the one left behind. Me and Britney, written in 2003, tells a story of her childhood friend Britney leaving to make it big in the entertainment industry, before eventually coming back, as Taylor is the only person Britney feels she can share her true self with. The song even ends with Taylor and Britney hanging out on the front porch like they did as children, almost 20 years before the Taylor of Fresh Out the Slammer would see her muse waiting for her out on their porch. Additionally, Taylor has commented on how she never grows up in songs like The Archer, and that celebrities become mentally stuck at the age they got famous in Miss Americana. Although the muses depicted in all these songs are responsible for their actions, something else Tortured Poets brings to the table is Taylor's increasing openness about how the music industry, and of course the patriarchal underpinnings of it, engenders and enables the very harm she wants to use love to escape from. If the rekindled flame muse to Taylor represented a chance to go back to this formative age and reclaim her lost girlhood, then the loss of that relationship served as doubled harm. No longer can she hide from her grief at her long-term relationship ending, nor can she hide from her loss of herself. The bruises of adulthood now have a thumb digging in. The reaction Taylor has to losing the rekindled flame throughout Tortured Poets embodies what psychotherapist Pete Walker calls the abandonment melange, which he describes as the terrible emotional mix of fear and shame that coalesces around the death-like feelings of depression that afflict an abandoned child. Walker here is talking about complex PTSD, often just called CPTSD, which is often brought on by childhood abuse and neglect. I think Taylor would agree that becoming famous at such a young age has had many of the same effects on her psyche. The ghosting of the rekindled flame muse has triggered what Walker calls an emotional flashback, the hallmark symptom of CPTSD, wherein the person is recapitulated into the original experience of abandonment. Fear is immediately triggered and soon produces shameful feelings of self-hate. This self-hate is a self-rejection that mimics parental rejection, and that is equivalent to self-abandonment. Self-abandonment in turn deepens the abandonment depression and creates an even more fearful state, which in turn generates even more shame about the fear, which triggers increasingly depressing self-abandonment. Aside from fear, shame, and depression, emotional flashbacks can also induce feelings of alienation, rage, and grief. Additionally, flashbacks can range in intensity from subtle to horrific. They can also vary in duration, ranging from moments to weeks on end, where they devolve into what many therapists call a regression. Of note, Walker goes on to say that at its worst, the self-abandonment triggers people to start quoting lines from Down Bad. More than a few of my clients have uttered things that sound like this. Life is so hopelessly depressing, I might as well be dead. Take me now, God, why don't you?
Stood on the cliffside, screaming, "Give me a reason." Your faithless love's the only cause I believe in. Don't want no other shade of blue but you. No other sadness in the world would do.
While I don't know or care if the rekindled flame muse is also the muse for Maroon, the Scarlet Maroon line in the song Chloe or Sam or Sophia or Marcus clearly puts these losses in parallel, and the fact that Maroon is even named after a shade of red puts that song in conversation with her entire Red album. Another interesting parallel emerges in the line, "You turned me into an idea of sorts," an echo from All Too Well 10's "The idea you had of me, who was she?" What I think is happening here, beyond potential muse misdirection, is Taylor suggesting that these losses all had the same effect, a shattering of herself at a particularly vulnerable time. In other words, this wounding feels the same as when her transition from childhood to adulthood was ruined. "I like to be my old self again, but I'm still trying to find it," she sings in All Too Well, whereas her question at the end of Chloe's chorus implies that this old self is potentially lost forever. The TikToker Mary Han Music also makes the poignant suggestion that the familiar tropes of hands and hair and the apartment setting suggest Taylor is trying to indulge in memories in the opening lines of the song, but has just changed so much as a person that the version of herself her lover's with might as well be some fucking rando named Marcus. When we view the muse for Chloe et al. As a stand-in for Taylor's lost youth, interesting things emerge. First, the line "you turned me into an idea of sorts" becomes tinged with irony, and that's exactly what Taylor has done to the rekindled flame. Second, the chorus just hurts more.
You wanna break my cold heart. Just say I loved you the way that you were.
The line, "just say I loved you the way that you were," is particularly poignant, given that songs like Midnight Rain see Taylor insist that changing herself like a one-woman ship of Theseus was worth it. Further, the verse, "I changed into goddesses, villains, and fools, all to outrun my desertion of you," can now be placed in conversation with other comments she's made, such as this one from her 2019 Rolling Stone interview. "Since I was 15 years old, if people criticized me for something, I changed it. So you realize you might be this amalgamation of criticisms that were hurled at you, and not an actual person who's made any of these choices themselves." The lost youthful self is an idea of sorts because Taylor was so quick to abandon herself in the face of criticism. She became a mirror ball, which is not exactly famous for having a solid core beneath its flashy shell. If we take this self-muse reading further, the line, "just say I loved you the way that you were," begs the question of whether any of these changes were worth it at all. This self-abandonment, however, is too painful to face directly and must be displaced onto another. That doesn't mean Taylor is able to stop herself from picking at the wound, though. In an interesting turn of phrase, that the muse's hologram stumbles into her apartment rather than their ghost implies Taylor is deliberately wallowing in this fantasy, as holograms are pieces of technology rather than a supernatural force. How would a hologram even be able to appear in your apartment if you had not knowingly installed its parts? The question of why she would do this is revealed by the bridge.
So if I sell my apartment and you have some kids with an internet starlet, will that make your memory fade from the scarlet maroon? Like it never happened, would it be enough just to float in your orbit? Can we watch our phantoms like watching wild horses? Cooler in theory, but not if you force it to be. It just didn't happen.
First, Taylor wonders if selling her apartment and the muse having children of their own will make the bruise in memory heal, before she tries in vain to reestablish a connection. I could write a whole lot about how Taylor uses both positive and negative memories to reclaim and continuously reestablish ownership of her experiences. But what's worth noting here is how re-excavating a relationship on a song like this reestablishes a connection to the person involved, even if they have long since moved on. As long as she's able to romanticize their past together, she can hold on to the shared fantasy that the other person longs for her too, that deep down they too wish things had turned out differently. The memory returns to being a supernatural force beyond her control, which she seeks to stake some kind of ownership of through her mental gaze, however briefly. Historical revisionism strikes again as well, as the last time the word phantom appeared on Tortured Poets is in LOML. Can we watch our phantoms, rather than them watching me fail to get out of bed? But the muse's disregard for her, a disregard she cannot bear to place directly on her youthful self, knowing that she is the one who deserted the younger her, robs her of even the illusion of a lingering connection, not to mention her last bit of control over the narrative. That Taylor can recognize how her attempts to remain connected and controlled by a memory are cooler in theory but not if you force it, is heart-wrenching, but it also represents an important new insight. By the time this lost youth storyline reaches its conclusion in the manuscript, the story isn't hers anymore, but neither we nor seemingly Taylor herself truly knows what's in store. The short film of All Too Well had her shift the burden of memory onto her ex-lover's shoulders, as he watches her public reading from out in the snow, wearing what once was her red scarf. In the manuscript, however, the story is still in her possession, but if she no longer recognizes herself in the story, then who is she? She's changed all of herself like Midnight Rain, so what's left of the original her? Or to put it another way,
Say what doesn't kill you makes you aware. What happens if it becomes who you are?
I like how I said all that like I actually believe the song isn't about Joe. I mean the Blue Muse. What's that thing Walt Whitman said about containing multitudes?
I said one thought, two thought, red thought, blue thought. Hear me so cold, bitch, I think I need a flu shot. One thought, two thought, three thought, four thought. Got your pig in the kitchen cooking up the pork chops. One thought, two thought, red thought, blue thought.
Multi-Muse is both the best and worst thing Taylor Swift has ever done, songwriting-wise. On one hand, it's brilliant and makes the album a lot more fascinating than if the story had been presented more straightforwardly. But it also means I have to see everyone else's incorrect opinions all the time, and it makes me wish I could explode people's phones with my mind. If you don't know what I'm talking about when I say a lot of songs are multi-muse, I'll go through a quick example. The first verse of LOML is, as Ellie McLaughlin, author of the Annotated Poetry of Taylor Swift, notes, Lover the song fits the rhythm of a waltz. She also notes that stitching can echo the stitches undone in So Long London, and though we know the steps anyway, foretells we learn the right steps to different dances in the much later song How Did It End? Additionally, if we take songs like Hits Different, Renegade, You're Losing Me, Afterglow, and The Great War as being about the Blue Muse, then rekindling a relationship can also refer to repairing it after a breakup or major fight. By contrast, Rachel Fader and Tiffany Tatro read Just Kids in both this song and Peter as references to Patti Smith's memoir. However, in the case of Peter, the potential reference to Smith is undercut by the more direct reference to Jane Eyre and Invisible String.
I have a strange feeling with regard to you. As if I had a string somewhere under my left ribs, tightly knotted to a similar string in you. And if you were to leave, I'm afraid that cord of communion would snap. And I have a notion that I'd take to bleeding inwardly. As for you, you'd forget me.
This ties into the more obvious reference to Peter Pan, where Pan, being a careless young boy, promises to take Wendy back to Neverland every spring before slowly forgetting about her. Peter, as being strictly about the rekindled flame muse, also has a slight reality problem. Many fans of Matty Healy have taken umbrage with the line, "But life was always easier on you than it was on me," as being simply untrue. Now, I don't know much about Healy's backstory beyond what Halsey described in her song Colors, but I do know that most people don't start using heroin because their life is awesome. Speaking of drugs, though, if we connect Chloe et al. Back to the Blue Muse, as is encouraged by the recurrent images like hands and hair, the apartment setting, and parallels like Would It Be Enough to Just Float in Your Orbit and Tried to Orbit His Planet from the In Summation poem, then we're talking about someone who also needs drugs, just psychiatric ones. Although the drug addiction reading is more obvious, I Couldn't Watch It Happen could just as easily refer to not being able to watch someone destroy those around them because of a refusal to seek therapy. In other words, not wanting to watch someone sacrifice us to the gods of your bluest days. Arguably, reading these lines as someone who chooses stagnation and passivity is more in line with the characterization in Chloe's other verses, where the muse simply watches the narrator attempt again and again to spark a reaction from them. A similar dynamic appears on You're Losing Me, to the extent that intentionally, going out with someone who looks like they would have shoved your ex in a locker could very well be a continuation of sending signals and glaring at you with storms in my eyes. Additionally, we know from the differences between the voice memo and the studio versions of My Boy Only Breaks His Favorite Toys that this kind of muse blurring was done intentionally. Interestingly, although many of the fans' reaction I saw when the voice memo dropped were about the Blue Muse, he said forever, then he blew it up, could work for both of Tortured Poet's main muses. After all, in songs like Renegade and You're Losing Me, the Blue Muse is squeezing her hand as she's about to leave, running down the hallway after her, breadcrumbing her with promises. And Tortured Poet's title track explains the other muse's actions quite well. It's He Saw Forever in the studio version that speaks more towards the blurrier, avoidant, anxious attachment dance on an album like 1989. I mean, geez, even the Red Muse told me about your past thinking your future was me. This dissonance can apply to even more straightforward songs. Florida, with 3 exclamation points, which on a surface level seemingly relates to the 2023 Miami Stops on the Eras tour after her breakup with Joe, was recorded in December of 2022, according to the New Orleans band who played on it. The Alchemy, which many assign to Travis Kelce, has its own problems. Now, I'm not a ball knower myself, but the expert consultant I had review the lyrics with me, my fiance trapped with me in a Freddy's drive-thru, described seeing Travis Kelce and the Kansas City Chiefs as underdogs as a position held by both tail ends of the IQ bell curve. Either she's done some insanely deep football analysis or none at all. So, okay, we can convincingly muddy the waters on a whole bunch of songs, so what's the point of this strategy? What's the benefit? When I think of this aspect of the album, I think of the things they carried, where Vietnam vet Tim O'Brien mediates on the difference between story truth and happening truth, and how story truth is sometimes truer than happening truth. One character provides an example. If Rat told you that he slept with 4 girls one night, you could figure it was about a girl and a half. It wasn't a question of deceit, just the opposite. He wanted to heat up the truth, to make it burn so hot that you could feel exactly what he felt. For Rat Kiley, I think, facts were formed by sensation. Tim O'Brien himself says that story truth makes the happening truth present again. I can look at things I never looked at. I can attach faces to grief and love and pity and God. I can be brave. I can make myself feel again. Additionally, having so much of the album be multi-muse provides opportunities for readers to reflect on the similarities in these relationships and how Taylor's characters on Tortured Poets remain trapped in the same vicious cycle. The ghosts in Tortured Poets are all echo, cursed to repeat the last thing spoken to them by lovers too obsessed with their own reflections. While discussing the novel A Jewish Mother, scholar Irene Kakandas argues that narrative witnessing is an essential component of healing from trauma, as in the absence of a sympathetic listener with whom to construct the story of the traumatic event, the trauma continues to surface a symptom waiting to be narrated. She argues that when it comes to literature that depicts traumatic events, one needs to investigate components of witnessing at the level of the story, that is, the events that make up the plot, at the level of the text, that is, the specific forms the telling of those events takes, and at the level of the production and reception of the text, that is, the reader/listener. To her, text can be about trauma, as in traumatic things happen in the plot, but they can also perform trauma in the sense that they fail to tell the story by eliding, repeating, and fragmenting components of the story. Later on, when describing how traumatized characters in A Jewish Mother both fail to describe the crimes that happened to them and fail to be understood by others, Kakandas says lacunae in the text may mirror the lacunae created in the victim character's psyche, but they may also be a sign of the text's performance of trauma. Consequently, the reader is not simply told what happened, because the process of cognizance of the event is bounded with witnessing, which in this case means the reader witness registers gaps and fragments as possible traumatic symptoms. This creates a trail of indirection leading the reader on a hunt for answers, only to have to fall back on herself, noting what is not there and registering the demand for a new kind of listening reading. In other words, to bring our discussion back to Tortured Poets, the confusion and frustration are the whole point, as they force the reader-listener to inhabit a similar position to the traumatized narrator. But what do I mean when I say traumatized?
I went there behind the crude but serious belief that you had to be able to look at anything. Serious because I acted on it and went. Crude because I didn't know it took the war to teach it. That you were as responsible for everything you saw as you were for everything you did. The problem was that you didn't always know what you were seeing until later. Maybe years later. That a lot of it never made it in at all. It just stayed stored there in your eyes.
One of the central ideas within literary trauma theory is the idea that the trauma is in some way unknowable when it occurs, which precludes one both from feeling the full effects of the trauma when it happens and from being able to make truth claims about what has happened. Trauma theory as a framework for cultural criticism, not just literature but essays, movies, even history itself, was born from Sigmund Freud's revision of his own drives theory. In 1920, he published Beyond the Pleasure Principle, an essay based on his experiences trying to treat soldiers returning from World War I. Here, he introduced the idea of the death drive, a tendency towards self-destruction rather than self-pleasure. Additionally, he identified trauma as not simply the traumatic event itself, but the lack of appropriate feeling during it. This lack of
Angstbereitschaft
or readiness to feel anxiety cause the event to linger within the patient's mind, locking them into a cycle of compulsive repetition. As Kathy Caruth explains, what seems to be suggested by Freud and Beyond the Pleasure Principle is that the wound of the mind, the breach in the mind's experience of time, self, and the world, is not like the wound of the body, a simple and healable event, but rather an event that is experienced too soon, too unexpectedly, to be fully known, and is therefore not available to consciousness until it imposes itself again, repeatedly, in the nightmares and repetitive actions of the survivor. Trauma is not locatable in the simple, violent, or original event in an individual's past, but rather in the way that its very unassimilated nature, the way it is precisely not known in the first instance, returns to haunt the survivor later on. If we were to quickly relate this to a Taylor Swift song, it would probably be Would've, Could've, Should've, with lines like, "Now that I'm grown, I'm scared of ghosts," and "The wound won't close, I keep on waiting for a sign." Although the narrator now knows the experience her younger self desired, she still lacks clarity because that's in death, in an ending that remained eternally deferred. But what might cause an event to be unknowable to you as it happens? As Eric L. Santner explains, in Freud's view, traumatic events overstimulate the psyche, particularly the
Reizschutz.
the protective shield or psychic skin that normally regulates the flow of stimuli and information across the boundaries of the self. This means that Freud, and thus many trauma theorists' definition of trauma is much, much broader than our modern one. To give but one example, the essay by Santner I'm currently quoting from is about Germans experiencing the trauma of needing to rebuild their national identity post-World War II. I'm not trying to shit on Santner here by any means, because he's highly critical of the Germans, but most people today would not consider a German filmmaker coping and seething for 15 and a half hours because Germany suddenly isn't cool anymore to be an expression of trauma. This definition also makes trauma much more pervasive, which has many far-reaching consequences. Kathy Caruth, who many cite as a founder of trauma studies, conflates history itself with trauma. Through the notion of trauma, I will argue, we can understand that a rethinking of references aims not at eliminating history, but at resituating it in our understanding. That is, as precisely permitting history to arise where immediate understanding may not. This is not without its interesting uses. As she says this, she is reading Freud's Moses and Monotheism, a theory of Jewish history that she claims is marked with gaps that reflect Freud's own trauma. After all, while writing the book, he had to flee Austria for London to escape the Nazis. She writes, the interval between the prefaces, which Freud explicitly notes, which is also the literal space between before March 1938 and in June 1938, also marks implicitly the space of a trauma not simply denoted by the words German invasion, but rather borne by the words I left. Freud's writing preserves history precisely within this gap in his text, and within the words of his leaving, words that do not simply refer, but through the repetition in the later summary and recapitulation, convey the impact of a history precisely as what cannot be grasped about leaving. In other words, the fact that Freud's trauma is not fully expressed, and yet continues to haunt his other activities speaks more to their psychic events than a straightforward and then this happened style of representation. To explain it another way, I'm going to turn to biblical trauma studies. In response to a quote by Charlotte Delbo, a Holocaust survivor, I am no longer sure that what I have written is true, but I am sure that it happened. Biblical scholar David Janzid helpfully notes that the case is not always that the authors of traumatic literature cannot recall the events that caused them massive psychic trauma. The impossibility they face instead is in situating the trauma within an explanatory framework so that they can make truth claims about it and explain and make sense of it. The unassimilated void, which defies the ability of language, which resists narrativization, is really a gap in narrative rather than narrative itself. Because trauma is simply not integrated into the worldviews people use to make sense of things, it cannot be a part of any explanatory narrative, and so it naturally moves to absence. I am no longer sure that what I have written is true, but I am sure that it happened. Although the circumstances around Delbo's statement are obviously very different than anything Taylor Swift has experienced, her sentiment is echoed in lyrics like, the more I think about it now, the less I know. All I know is that you drove us off the road. Or they say all's well that ends well, but I'm in a new hell every time you double-cross my mind. Or the even blunter, memories feel like weapons. In all these cases, memory has lost its explanatory power, in the former two because memory does not offer a coherent story, and in the latter because memory outright betrays its holder. This, to me, is the great benefit of trauma theory, that it gives strategies and vocabulary for looking at how trauma manifests in ways seemingly unrelated to the event itself. Of course, just because trauma may move towards absence and betrayal does not mean it doesn't compel survivors to try to make sense of it anyway. Already you might be thinking of certain songs from Midnights or Tortured Poets. In Bigger Than the Whole Sky, for instance, the narrator asks if her loss was because of something as simple and inevitable as a butterfly flapping its wings. In The Smallest Man Who Ever Lived, the narrator struggled to understand her ex's actions, lead her to all sorts of conspiratorial thinking. From him simply using her to write a book to him being a deep state agent sent to drive her to suicide. Still, the main focus on a lot, though not all, of trauma theory is on silence. To relate to our modern moment, the fact that so much of the COVID-19 pandemic has been memory hold, echoing the lack of art depicting the Spanish flu, speaks to the collective trauma of the event. Even Taylor's own Folklore, which many of us would consider the best piece of pandemic art, still only has one song about the pandemic, which fans do not talk about and which Taylor has only played for a live audience once. Within the song Epiphany, refrains like, "and some things you just can't speak about," and "but you dream of some epiphany, just one single glimpse of relief, to make some sense of what you've seen," attempt to not only establish a parallel between the trauma of World War II soldiers and that of pandemic healthcare workers, but to highlight the absences within these traumas. Not only is the victim unable to speak of their experiences, but they yearn for an epiphany to explain what is happening to them, an epiphany which the song denies. This song, and others like Ronin and Soon You'll Get Better, are understandably not brought up much in fandom discussions. Aside from the heavy task of speaking of their events respectfully, these songs are siloed off because they cannot be integrated into the fandom's daily task of interrogating Taylor Swift's narrative TM. In other words, that cannot be made fun. This idea of making traumatic experiences fun is one I want to return to, but not right now. The problem of defining trauma becomes more complicated when you get into hot debates over how to even define PTSD, much less mental disorders that are typically traumagenic, like borderline personality disorder and dissociative identity disorder, both of which have tons of debate over whether they're even real. I'm not going to get into all that here, but just know that Chris Bruin, author of Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, Malady or Myth, states that PTSD is not a qualitatively distinct response to extreme trauma, but rather reflects the upper end of a stress response continuum, and that is not the symptoms themselves, but rather their frequency, their persistence, their intensity, and their failure to become more benign with time that define the disorder. In other words, it's not your response to the wound that's necessarily at issue, but that the wound won't close. Just to make things more complicated, let's again consider CPTSD, which is not an official diagnosis, but was coined by Harvard psychiatrist Judith Herman in her seminal book, Trauma and Recovery. The idea behind CPTSD is that, unlike PTSD, the inciting trauma stretches over a longer period of time and is usually located in one's childhood. As Herman argues, survivors of prolonged abuse developed characteristic personality changes, including deformations of relatedness and identity. As Susan J. Breeson, herself a survivor of rape and attempted murder, writes, working through traumatic memories involves a shift from being the object or medium of someone else's speech to being the subject of one's own. This requires not only forming the trauma into a coherent, integrated narrative, but also reintegrating the survivor into a community, reestablishing connections essential to selfhood. To Breeson, trauma is not merely an overwhelming of the psychic senses, but when your subjectivity is rendered useless and viewed as worthless. Judith Herman makes her return here, writing that the traumatic event thus destroys the belief that one can be oneself in relation to others. Breeson adds that without this belief, one can no longer be oneself even to oneself, since the self exists fundamentally in relation to others. Psychoanalyst Dory Laub, who specialized in working with Holocaust survivors, theorized that the core of an extremely traumatic experience is a complete failure of the empathetic human dyad. Human responsiveness came to be non-existent in the death camps. A thou responsive to one's basic needs no longer existed. Faith in the possibility of communication died. Intrapsychically, there was no longer a matrix of two people, a self and a resonating other. This despair of being able to communicate with others diminished the victim's ability to be in contact and in tune with themselves, and to be able to register their own experience or reflect upon it. When the empathetic other totally fails in the external world of the death camps, the internal empathetic thou, the means for self-dialogue, ceases to exist. The ongoing internal dialogue, the internal I speaking to the internal thou, which allows for historicity, narrative, and meaning to unfold, falls silent. Janice McLean describes a similar mechanism behind self-harming behaviors like self-mutilation and eating disorders, the instances of which are higher in traumatized populations. As McLean writes, through self-harm, the self-mutilator hears herself through her own body, creating a voice on the skin that attempts to make the necessary reflective structure of self, other, and world within the one avenue of expression she has control over. That ultimately, for those who have no voice but of silence, extremity is the only possibility for the expression and ultimate ending of pain. I think not only of Taylor's multiple references to suicide throughout the album when I hear stuff like that, but of her sarcastic reassurance in Who's Afraid of Little Old Me that her circus handlers have pulled out all of her teeth. These assertions also recall several lines in I Hate It Here, such as "This place made me feel worthless," and "I dreamed about it in the dark the night I felt like I might die," a pretty obvious reference to the events of 2016. Worth adding is that, similarly to songs like Who's Afraid of Little Old Me, the trauma presented in I Hate It Here is not isolated to one person. Porpentine, a trans femme writing of her traumatic experiences in the semi-viral essay Hot Allostatic Load, says that mobbing, defined as emotional abuse practiced by a group of people, has an unusually strong power to damage the victim's relationship to society because it cannot be written off as an outlier, as some singular monster. It reveals a fundamental truth about people that makes it difficult to trust ever again. People become like aliens, like a pack of animals that can turn on you as soon as some mysterious pheromone shift marks you for death. Porpentine likens this to the medieval punishment of living burial, a feminine-coded punishment that allowed execution without having to actually be there at the moment of death. As Taylor herself says, they've taken out her teeth, so she spends most of her year inside her head, the place, to which only she has the key. Let's ask the obvious question. How could you possibly write yourself out of this?
Take the bus. Listen, Mr. Lee, they could kill one another. Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah, but we can't be involved with murder. Exactly, Randy. Mr. Lee, is this you talking or the liquor? Randy. I am the liquor.
Well, let's start with a few ways she captured these failures before we get to how she got herself out. To return to theory for just a moment, Krista Schoenfelder writes that theorizations with too narrow an emphasis on how trauma disrupts and hinders narration risk overlooking the fact that trauma also has a strong tendency to produce narration. It is problematic for trauma theory to insist on the preservation of the truth and full force of trauma, while ignoring trauma victims' needs, especially their need for narration and desire for integration and recovery. I even cut off the last few words of that quotation from Jansen earlier, where he says that attempts to narrativize trauma are ultimately futile. Speak for yourself, girl. Sometimes, though, this integration and story formation can only come through story truth rather than happening truth. And this story truth can sometimes only be accentuated by its silences. To this end, Taylor uses natural silences afforded by the medium of an album, not just the literal silence at the end of a song, but the metaphorical silences of missing explanations, to accentuate her narrative by recreating her emotional landscape on a more visceral level. Let's start with The Alchemy, the second to last song in the standard version. It's a weird one, I think we can all agree with that. This happens once every few lifetimes, except for the fact that it's already happened on, every project you've ever put out, girl. Hell, it's already happened on this very album. I Felt a Glow Like This, Never Before and Never Since was literally 3 songs ago. And our lines like "These chemicals hit me like white wine" supposed to be read in context of songs like Fortnite, where the narrator is a functioning alcoholic. Given that the narrator of The Alchemy has just returned from the hospital, is this supposed to be the narrator of Fortnite getting out of the rehab? Or what about The Smallest Man Who Ever Lived, where Taylor's narrator compares the pain of being ghosted to the pain of drug withdrawal? That was only 1 song ago. As I've already mentioned, my expert ball knower has said a case could be made to justify the underdog narrative on this song. Still, the plain paper facts rate Travis Kelce among the top 5 of all tight ends in NFL history, according to this 2024 article by AP News that has a bunch of stats that presumably mean a lot of things. Makes it seem like a PR relationship, doesn't it? My fiancé had joked. Truthfully, I don't care much whether Tavis is or is not PR. The answer I gave to him then was that I felt as though this song was intentionally written so that it could be easily slotted into a denial playlist in the next promo cycle. Think of it like this. Fresh out of the mental hospital, the narrator feels a familiar alcohol-like rush and circles who knew love on a map the way someone forced into rehab might mentally list all the liquor stores they're going to pass by on the way home. Unlike the chemistry she felt with the "But Daddy, I Love Him" muse, she knows she's actively creating this fantasy. Rather than memories we embroidered, this past child's play is forgiven under her rule. She's now the one to beat, and her lover jokes that it's heroin, but this time with an E, finally making Taylor the love drug of choice rather than its user. As I expressed however many millions of minutes ago, this strategy of getting into relationships where she feels some subtle sense of power over the muse is littered throughout Tortured Poets, and is an avoidant tactic. Rather than using self-sacrifice to avoid her problems, however, here she places herself on a pedestal. This would also explain the rewriting of Travis Kelce's accomplishments. Portraying her muse as an underdog not only fits within common sports tropes, but elevates her importance as his lover. After all, the picture she paints is not one of her simply supporting her hardworking man as he accomplishes his dreams, but him accomplishing this Herculean task, proving all the haters wrong, and then forsaking the trophy to run over to her because she's the real prize. I said on Twitter the other day that Taylor revising Kelce into an underdog is my favorite piece of proof that The Alchemy is actually about the fans, and it's only half a joke. Reading the muse of The Alchemy as Taylor's place within American culture fits almost eerily well. The greatest in the league line requires little rewriting here. Over and over throughout her career, Taylor has taken risks that many said would absolutely fail, changing genres, the re-records, even the sheer scale and size of the Eras tour. And each time her fans have pulled through for her. We enjoy seeing Taylor top charts and win awards, sure, but more than that, we enjoy her and her art. And it is alchemy, turning the raw materials of memory into gold megaphones and certifications. It's calculated and man-made. And even if many claim that this is all fraud, who are we to fight it? Regardless of the true muse, reading this song is more about the narrator consciously choosing to fall back into self-destructive habits, which sufficiently explain how The Alchemy functions as evidence that Taylor was in a state of temporary insanity. Additionally, both readings of The Alchemy are thematically paid off in the final song on Standard, Clarabout, where Taylor again attacks what she views as the true source of her issues, the cyclical violence of the music industry itself. If The Alchemy is simply about her being self-destructive, then Clarabout is where the high of knowingly reverting back to your worst self wears off. The crown is hers, but it's stained with blood. If The Alchemy is about her fans and career, then the use of "you're the new god we're worshipping" becomes drawn into greater focus. The dedication of her fanbase has caused many to compare Swiftyism to a new religious movement, essentially the PC word for cult, as fans spend thousands or tens of thousands on tickets and merch, collect every new release, call her their older sister and therapist and mother, and wait in tents for months on end to secure a chance to see her on tour. Many a cultural critic has called Taylor Swift and stan culture at large a replacement for the role that the church once held in people's lives. But one day, her place within this pantheon will be gone. No matter how many reinventions she goes through, someday someone else is going to walk into that smoke-filled room and be fed all the same lines she once was. The someday fever dream and nothing new is coming any day now, if it hasn't already. In this way, we could view the entire album as her writing herself into this conclusion, truly facing not the possibility, but the dark reality that she will be replaced. The album that starts off with a one-off reference to Sylvia Plath's suicide ends with the narrator's communal death foretold by the dead woman herself. This reading is reflected sonically as well. The Alchemy begins with a low, drawling performance similar to Mr. Leahy saying he's the liquor.
Maybe I'm not the liquor.
Why don't you try one of these liquorsicles, Mr. Leahy? Then tell me who's not the liquor. You are the liquor. You've always been the liquor, Mr. Leahy.
With the music also taking a second to start really gearing up. The song then builds to a huge pop crescendo, a vibrant, happy mood that's already starting to deflate by the end, and then is completely destroyed by the somber, ominous guitars of Clarabout. The end of the standard version has another productive silence, as the final dazzling is swallowed up, extinguished like the last tiny flame of a candle. Then we open the anthology, where the Black Dog ends with Taylor barely able to let the final utterance of screaming escape from her mouth. And then, a Reputation Vault track. I'm Gonna Get You Back. As the host of the podcast that Taylor Seminars have joked, this transition feels very much like Taylor's character deciding she's done being sad, putting on her fishnets and high heels, and going to the bar to either seduce her old love or smash a glass over his head. Think of it like a comic book. On each page, you not only have the panels, but you have the space between panels, as well as the gutters where each page is bound together. As comic theorists and creators like Gillian Whitlock, Art Spiegelman, and Scott McCloud argue, comics require a new interpretive framework because they require the reader to not just look at the images passively, but interpret their interconnections, filling in the narrative spaces between gutters and panels. Thus, readers actively provide their own closure for a text. Art Spiegelman, Mouse Guy if you don't recognize the name,
Mouse is in the house,
even says that, "I didn't want people to get too interested in the drawings for Mouse. I wanted them to be there, but the story operates somewhere else. It operates somewhere between the words and the idea that's in the pictures, and in the movement between the pictures. So by not focusing you too hard on these people, you're forced back into your role as a reader rather than looker. Additionally, when discussing one of his other memoir comics, In the Shadow of No Towers, Spiegelman described the practice of daily comic writing as sorting through my grief and putting it into boxes. Now let's shift gears to So High School. The placement of So High School is interesting because the lyrics themselves seem to, and indeed are often treated by fans as if they definitively do, provide closure to many of the themes on Tortured Poets, wanting to reclaim one's childhood, drinking, smoking, even madness. I say seemingly, though, because upon closer inspection, these are not paid off entirely. The material being drunk is now the muse's thoughts rather than alcohol, concretizing that which was just implied in the alchemy. But again, the high of their joke is merely the opposite coin face of the withdrawal symptoms in The Smallest Man Who Ever Lived. Additionally, though it's the last scene of taking drugs in the anthology, I Look in People's Window still has its I Am Addicted to the If Only line a few songs later. I'm Hearing Voices Like a Madman situates the source of her relative madness in the muse doing silly impressions, in self-evidently playing a character, as opposed to men who deceitfully play brave men and perform even after the stage lights have been broken. Interestingly, though, many of the songs after this in the anthology have Taylor casting herself and others in her life as characters. The Balter takes a lighthearted approach to this, while Thank You Amy jokes about this outright, but Cassandra, Peter, and the manuscript do this completely straight-faced. The prophecy even shares Cassandra's element of comparing Taylor to a mythological figure and rewriting that figure's story in the same breath, as well as the line, cards on the table, mine play out like fools in a fable. Indeed, to me, it is this connection to the prophecy that cements the fact that So High School exists in the realm of idealization. The song directly before So High School, How Did It End, closes with Taylor admitting that she still doesn't truly understand how her relationship with the Blue Muse collapsed. So she does what she did when the relationship with the Blue Muse was ending, but she hadn't technically called it quits. She gets with someone new, and this someone reminds her of her youth. So High School stands on its own as a happy song, certainly, but just because something is a shoddy coping mechanism overall doesn't mean it has to feel that way as it's happening. The very next song, however, has the idealization phase give way to suspicion. After the high of new relationship energy begins to subside, Taylor remembers that comfort is a construct and that good luck, read invisible strings, fated lovers, etc., isn't real. This would explain why the use of throttle is echoed in the prophecy. Regardless of how Taylor feels in the present day, she uses the sequencing of the album's sound and lyrical motifs to perform the cycle of idealization, devaluation, and despair she is stuck in. If there is a real cycle breaker, though, it's the return to adolescence and the concurrent acceptance of the past as a reference, rather than something that can be totally erased and rewritten. Speaking of rewriting...
The Bible. This is the Bible. You question the words of the mighty Jimmy?
As we all know, biblical references are all over the Tortured Poets department. Some relatively straightforward, others logically or temporally incoherent. In isolation, lines like, "What if I roll the stone away? They're going to crucify me anyway," may seem like a songwriting flub. Jesus' crucifixion, after all, came before he was in tune, because that's how the whole dying thing works. Upon reflection, however, every reference to God, Jesus, or some other aspect of the Christian tradition within the Tortured Poets department has something wrong with it. And it is every single one. I'm not going to list them all here because I have an essay that does that, but trust me, even the ones I missed in my initial write-up still support my thesis. In my full essay, I found 6 major categories of religiously based textual gaps within the Tortured Poets department. But for the sake of brevity, we're only going to be focusing on 3. Sequential dissonances, as in things happening out of order, major reversals, as in biblical imagery or story being subverted or revised in a major way, and finally, the narrator is Jesus, but in his flop era. First up, aside from the roll the stone away line I just mentioned, we also have I'm seeing visions, am I bad or mad or wise from Guilty as Sin. As first pointed out to me by Stained Glassler on Twitter, this echoes C.S. Lewis's trilemma, which is often called lunatic, liar, or Lord, or mad, bad, or God. The idea that Jesus, to claim the things he did, is either insane, a mustache-twirling supervillain, or the Son of God. Here the order is switched, with bad coming first. Then, in Chloe et al., we have I change into goddesses, villains, and fools, which could be read as Lewis's trilemma going in reverse, from lord to liar to lunatic. More on this in a second. Perhaps the most obvious example of this category is, and it was written, I got cursed like Eve got bitten, from the prophecy. That's literally not what happened. Reading got bitten as metaphorical is one answer, although that contrasts with the sentence opening with, and it was written, implying this is the definitive version of events. For reference, Genesis 3 verses 4 through 7 say, But the serpent said to the woman, You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, he took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. We could potentially read this in conversation with the trilemma lines from Guilty as Sin and Chloe or Sam or Sophia or Marcus, especially the latter, as the narrator of Chloe moves from being wise, a place the scripture equates with being like God, to being a fool, which echoes the line, cards on the table, mind play out like fools in a fable. Where Taylor once sang that she met her lover in the darkest little paradise and would fall from grace just to touch their face, now she's desperately trying to rewrite the story to save Eve and herself from blame. Another way of reading this line, however, is through the lens of the Proto-Evangelium, the first gospel. This reading was suggested to me by Mile Romeo on Twitter, who theorized that this line is a playing out of Genesis 3:15, where God says to the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. To Christians, the first half of this verse refers to Adam and Eve's curse of sin, the second, Jesus' salvation of humanity from it. Like Eve, Taylor has been cursed, bitten by the snake, but in that biting is given the opportunity to stomp it to death. This would be another place where she tries to cast herself as Jesus, which, trust me, we will get to in a minute. In this reading, the lyric, was it punishment, as Mile Romeo points out, turns from a rhetorical to a genuine question. Taylor has made her Faustian bargain for fame and has conquered it, climbing to a level of stardom that allows her to rewrite industry rules, bypassing publishers and movie distributors for her Eras Tour book and film, inspiring other artists to re-record their old works or release vault tracks, and scaring record execs into putting clauses forbidding such acts into new contracts. Despite her objective victories, as critic Sophie Gilbert writes, on Tortured Poets, Taylor seems to be butting up against the reality that there are no cultural models for what she's become. Too earnest to be a diva, too workaholic to retreat into reclusion or retirement, she's stuck being an extraordinarily rich, influential, and powerful woman who still, somehow, feels like she has no real power at all. Tortured Poets, then, is stuck chafing at its own layers of lore and artifice, grabbing resentfully at the archetype, cliché, and torn-up fragments of Americana that Taylor has used to build up her empire. If the opening lines of the prophecy are read in terms of Genesis 3:15, then, we can see Taylor not as victimizing herself, but desperately asking, what now? Or, through the lens of Two Taylor theory, when am I, the inner Taylor, going to reap the same rewards as the brand Taylor? We'll circle back to this thought in a few minutes. Moving on, in So Long London, we have,
You swore that you loved me, but where were you? I died on the altar waiting for you. You sacrificed us to the gods of your blues.
Exquisite Williams, in the article Taylor Swift, Not a God, Not a Sacrifice, argues that this is a reversal of Abraham's attempted sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22, as Taylor's trust in her lover to meet her at the altar, to stay true to his promises of love, was used against her in the same way Isaac's trust in his father was. Okay, I can't wait to talk about this any longer.
On the top, make it drop, that's some wet ass pussy. Now get a bucket and a mop, that's some wet ass pussy. I'm talking rock, that's some wet ass pussy,
Aside from the obvious, I would have died for your sins, instead I just died inside, and the smallest man who ever lived, Williams argues that the muse hanging Taylor on the wall with push pins parallels Jesus' crucifixion, arguing that Taylor willingly submits herself to be sacrificed, expecting a grand finale she can then be resurrected from, only to end up betrayed. Additionally, William sees the line, "My spine split from carrying us up the hill" from So Long London as a likely reference to Jesus carrying his cross, although I think it's worth noting that only in the book of John is Jesus carrying his cross alone. John 19, verses 16 through 17 read, "So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha." To return to guilty of sin, stained glass are identified, "What if he's written mine on my upper thigh, only in my mind," is a potential reference to Revelations 19:16. In this line, the narrator describes a white rider that many interpret as Jesus, who on his robe and on his thigh has a name inscribed, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Down bad, waking up in blood, staring at the sky, come back and pick me up from down bad could also potentially be read as a reference to stigmata, wherein people claim to have fresh wounds or pain in the places where Jesus was crucified. This obviously contrasts with the song's explicit sci-fi theme, but she does say she is temporarily heaven struck in this song, and you know what, look, I'm not the one constantly comparing myself to Jesus elsewhere, okay? Regardless, this theophany theme on the standard version of the album is potentially paid off by the failed exorcism in The Black Dog, and the reverse trilemma in Chloe et al. In The Black Dog, we have the lines,
Sell my house and set fire to all my clothes, and hire a priest to come and exercise my tears, even if I die
This may be a bit of a stretch, but in Mark 19, Jesus exorcises a young boy. "And they brought the boy to him. When the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the father, 'How long had this been happening to him?' And he said, 'From childhood. It has often cast him into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you are able to do anything, help us. Have compassion on us.' After crying out and convulsing him terribly, the spirit came out, and the boy is like a corpse, so that most of them said, 'He is dead.' But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he was able to stand." So rather than Taylor only looking dead and being brought back to life, she assumes that the exorcism will be an agonizing death, and she's fine with it. Here, rather than being wise and godlike, she's literally lost her mind due to possession. Additionally, the demon trying to cast the child into the fire echoes the line about setting fire to her clothes, while the water potentially echoes, "I dream of cracking locks, throwing my life to the wolves," or "the ocean rocks," in Guilty of Sin. Finally, it's interesting to note that this passage is right before Jesus prophesies his own death. Again, this is likely a reach, but I thought it was, if nothing else, kind of a funny coincidence. Continuing this line of thought, we have "One bad seed kills the garden" from the Albatross. As Rachel Fader and Tiffany Tatro note, this parallels the parable of the weeds among the wheat in Matthew 13, verses 24 through 30, where Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good wheat in his field, but while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away." As Jesus explains in a later verse, this enemy is the devil, so Taylor has gone from trying to fill Jesus' sandals to being the very thing he stands against. Interestingly, the seed the devil plants represents the children of the evil one, which, given the mention of fake news in the song and its obvious conservative connotations, reminds me of men cry posting about how Taylor Swift is turning young women into Marxist feminists who get abortions for fun. If only. I would also be remiss if I didn't find a way to crowbar Clara Bow into this discussion. In the context of all this other Jesus imagery, the line, "The crown is stained, but you're the real queen," can easily be read as an echo of Jesus' crown of thorns, with flesh and blood amongst war machines being her crucifixion surrounded by Roman soldiers. Her crucifixion, she's assured by others, means she's a real queen, their new god, but even they know that they will get tired of her one day and move on to someone new.
What are you going to do? Goodbye, Brian, and thanks. All right, Brian. Give it up, lad. Terrific work, Brian.
I can never help but wonder how this line relates to "I looked around in a blood-soaked gown and I saw something they can't take away and you're on your own, kid." The same crowd she sings "You're on your own, kid" to is the one who demands more. More albums, more drama, more outfits, more PDA to write professionally self-published fanfics about. In a Lover-era interview with Vogue, Taylor Swift compared superstardom in the digital age to life in a dollhouse, one where voyeurs can ship you with who they want to ship you with, and they can favorite friends that you have, and they can know where you are all the time. On Tortured Poets, as Gilbert writes, she seems like a woman stuck in a fairy tale who escapes one gilded cage for another, and then another, and then another. Like I alluded to before, perhaps these cages, more so than the failed romances, are the prophecy Taylor seeks to rewrite. To bring us back to the prophecy, Another way of reading some of its lines would be through the lens of ancient Greco-Roman statue worship. Here, statues were channels for the divine, a practice believed to have originated in Egypt. In antiquity, as Susan Cain writes, cult statues were believed to have powers derived from the gods they represented. There is evidence to suggest that a daemon could reside in a statue of a divinity, which could make it powerful or animate it magically for the purposes of divination, prognostication, protection, or healing. She then refers to a quote from Asclepius, a Latin text that is part of the Hermetica, a body of theological/philosophical texts written in late antiquity that cover a huge range of topics, from medicine to magic to alchemy to the nature of good and evil. These texts were all supposedly authored by Hermes Trismegistus, the Steven Universe fusion of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. In this particular section, Hermes speaks to his pupil Asclepius. I mean statues, but statues living and conscious, filled with the breath of life, and doing many mighty works. Statues which have foreknowledge and predict future events by the drawing of lots, and by prophetic inspiration, and by dreams, and in many other ways. Statues which inflict diseases and heal them, dispensing sorrow and joy according to men's deserts. In this reading, the lyric, "But even statues crumble when they're made to wait," contains irony alongside its sadness. Taylor, the statue, is made to give prophecies, and now through one has been robbed of that purpose. Rather than literal foreknowledge like what Hermes refers to, though, the foreknowledge Taylor holds is most likely from her status as a role model for young women, a guiding light as per Dear Reader. This reading feels especially pertinent given that Cain continues by describing how many of these statues were hollowed out to be filled with various items that would imbue them with magical strength. She cites the Neoplatonist philosopher Proclus, who suggests that the hollowed parts of statues be filled with matter suitable to their attendant powers, things like sacrificed animals, plants, gems, inscribed objects, etc., etc. To him, a statue erected with such things inside could be inspired and moved with unspeakable strength. One example comes from Maximus, a court philosopher to the Roman Emperor Julian, often called Julian the Apostate by his Christian critics. Maximus is alleged to have used incantations and special incense to bring the face of the statue of Hecate to life. He made her smile and caused the torches in her hands to ignite spontaneously. You may be thinking now of Mirrorball and how Taylor shows us, the audience, every version of ourselves, reflecting back to us whatever we want to see. Hermes also writes that, even as God is the maker of the gods in heaven, so man is the fashioner of the gods who dwell in temples and are content to have men for their neighbors. Thus man not only receives the light of divine life, but gives it also. He not only makes his way upward to God, but he even fashions gods. Taylor gets us out on the floor through the light she reflects, but if we remember, dear reader, the fact that she shines so bright is a source of distress for her as much as it is a power. Like in Clairabeau, man, the audience, is the maker of gods, which means man can also just as easily strip their godhood away. While this reading is pretty out there, it would tie back into the references to Greek mythology and Cassandra, as well as the name-dropping of Aristotle in So High School. It's worth keeping in mind that although the prophecy begins by referencing the Bible, Taylor does not directly address the Christian God, instead asking who she has to speak to, and later gathering with a coven of sorceresses, to say nothing of how her cards on the table could easily be a reference to tarot. Indeed, the historian E.R. Dobbs makes the offhanded remark that vulgar magic like this is commonly the last resort of the personally desperate, of those whom man and God have alike failed. The mixing of Christian and other pagan mythologies in this song further illustrates the breaking down of Taylor's normal explanatory frameworks, as none can provide her a satisfactory narrative or path out of the darkness. As I mentioned before, this is only a small sample of the religious imagery on the album. Taken all together, this religious imagery seems to serve as the death rattle of Taylor's philosophy on love, which she has repeatedly written as a religion, especially on the album's Reputation and Lover. In Tortured Poets, Taylor wrestles first with a silent, brooding God, and then a love-bombing, lying God, before she is left pleading to whoever may be left in the sky to come save her from her fate. In doing so, biblical stories and traditions are twisted, sometimes to the breaking point, which signifies Taylor's attempts to fit her experiences into an explanatory framework like a triangle into a square hole. Like with the multi-muse aspect of the album, the destabilizing feeling that some of these lines invokes invites listener readers to share the same headspaces as Taylor's narrators, and take up the struggle to make sense of what's happened. I'm reminded of a passage from South African author Olive Schreiner's 1883 novel, The Story of an African Farm, which many consider to be one of the first feminist novels. And a new life begins for us. A new time. A life as cold as that of a man who sits on the pinnacle of an iceberg and sees the glittering crystals all about him. The old looks indeed like a long, hot delirium, peopled with fantasies. The new is cold enough. Now we have no God. We have had two. The old God that our fathers handed down to us, that we hated and never liked. The new one that we made for ourselves, that we loved, But now he has slid it away from us, and we see what he was made of, the shadow of our highest ideal, crowned and throned. Now we have no God. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. It may be so. Most things said or written have been the work of fools. Let's talk about the prophecy one last time. More specifically, let's talk about how the line, "My veins of pitch black ink" from the Instammation poem, one of the first things we ever saw of the Tortured Poets Department, is tragically paid off in the prophecy with poisoned blood from the wound of the pricked hand, and then feeling like the very last drops of an ink pen. The imagery of the pricked hand with poisoned blood reminds me of Sleeping Beauty, a curse Beauty gains at her birth. But if we connect this blood ink back to the first line in the song, "and it was written," we can see how the cycle of torment, this prophecy, is one enforced not just by cruel fate, but by texts. This line, if we look back, appears in several other places on the album. In LOML, the memories are embroidered with words. In Fresh at the Slammer, the rekindled flame muse is swirled into poems and sent promises by letters. In The Smallest Man Ever Lived, one of the possibilities raised is that the muse is writing an expose on her. In the title track, though the narrator rebukes her lover's attempts to compare the two of them to famous poets, she doesn't tell them to leave their typewriter at home, and so it stays with her at her apartment. Even Fortnite's music video is fixated on papers. Taylor and Post Malone working on typewriters, Taylor pulling out files and sending papers flying, them reuniting with a shot of them lying down in a pile of papers shaped like Taylor's face. Writing, then, is an act that not only shapes how Taylor approaches relationships, but how she constructs her selfhood, that her ink-filled veins are entered into evidence alongside the muses acquired like bruises, internal wounds producing narrative rather than narrative's absence, reinforces this idea that Taylor's relationship to writing itself is part of the problem. Think back to Invisible String from Folklore. Isn't it just so pretty to think all along there was some invisible string tying you to me? Whether the reference to Hemingway was accidental or not, allusions to Jane Eyre and other texts abound in Taylor's work. Before it was deleted, Florence had even posted a copy of Ted Hughes' poem Red on the Instagram page for her book club Between Two Books, prefacing it by saying that Taylor herself had recommended it as a prelude to the Tortured Poets Department. Hughes, in case you don't know, was married to Sylvia Plath from 1956 until their separation in 1962, with Plath's suicide coming only a year later. Not only is Plath's death referenced in the very first song on Tortured Poets, her poem Mad Girl's Love Song is referenced at the beginning of All Too Well's short film. When Sadie Sink's character says, "I just feel like maybe I made you up," her words echo Plath's refrain of, "I think I made you up inside my head." Mad Girl's Love Song shares many other thematic similarities with the Tortured Poets Department, such as in the lines, "I dreamed that you bewitched me into bed and sung me moonstruck, kissed me quite insane," or, "I fancied you'd return the way you said, but I grow old and forget your name." Over and over throughout her discography, Taylor has tried to put on different poets' death masks to see if the world makes any more sense through different eyes. By the end of the manuscript, however, the product of her work is something she only reads now and then, and something she no longer sees herself in. It doesn't escape my notice that "my veins of pitch black ink" are entered into evidence last, as though it's the final piece to tie the defendant's argument together. Or perhaps her final revelation. I stated earlier that Clairabeau, in some ways, feels like a song Taylor had to write the rest of the standard version to get to. Perhaps the same could be said of the manuscript, the first bonus track revealed and yet the last song on the anthology. There's a quote that comes to me now from Samuel Beckett's Text for Nothing No. 4. "That's the mistake I made, one of the mistakes, to have wanted a story for myself, whereas life alone is enough."
I've been feeling a little down lately. I keep wondering, why am I here? What is my purpose in life?
It sounds like you're suffering from what we healers call nothing.
Is it curable?
Curable? Sure. You want one hole in your head or two?
Of course, I'm partially sad watching the manuscript. I admit that my emotional response to the song focuses on his last verse, which makes me want to eat glass for reasons that aren't super relevant. Still, if Taylor's relationship to writing itself is a problem, what solutions are there other than giving up her career entirely? And at last, she knew what the agony had been for is the key to unlocking this question. In Literary Trauma, Sadism, Memory, and Sexual Violence in American Women's Fiction, Deborah Horvitz finds that a recurrent trope is the protagonist's varying capacities to use art, especially narrative, as a method of working through or healing from trauma. She concludes that power lies in the capacity to find or create individual, personal meaning from a traumatized and tortured past. If dramatic events are not repressed, they can be used. Victims remember and imagine stories to be repeated and passed on. That is, when the stories of the past are consciously recognized, the cycle of violence can end because the narratives, not the sadomasochism or the trauma, are repeated and passed on. Throughout Tortured Poets, Taylor has struggled with accepting the reality that there's no way to truly recover what she perceives as her lost self. Indeed, given the gaps discussed earlier, Peter could very well be about Taylor accepting that this self is lost to the Lost Boys chapter of her life. However, the album closes with a few positive models of turning out the light. While Peter uses its fictionality to signal how Taylor's narrator is able to finally recognize her past love for who he is and take control of her own narrative, other anthology songs like Thank You, Amy, The Bolter, Robin, and then of course the manuscript, showcase Taylor deploying fictionality in various attempts to reframe events and reconstruct a healed self. While I've already spoken at length about So High School, and I definitely didn't forget about Thank You, Amy's existence until my mother asked me to play the Kim diss track in the car, Thank You, Amy shares with it a lot of similarities. Most obviously the high school teen tropes, specifically the trope where the most popular girl in school has it out for the unpopular plucky underdog because... Whereas So High School uses young adult genre trappings to enhance the feeling of youthful buoyancy that comes with love, Thank You, Amy admits to using them in a similar manner to Taylor's handling of homophobia in You Need to Calm Down, rendering something incredibly traumatic and sinister into a series of petty tantrums. Additionally, the song shares DNA with its predecessor, I Hate It Here, with the final chorus of all that time you were throwing punches, it was all for nothing, and our town looks so small from way up here, or calling I Hate It Here's refrain of small town fears, and in my fantasies I rise above it, and way up there I actually love it. Indeed, Thank You, Amy being after I Hate It Here could symbolize character progression. However, given that the very next song is I Look in People's Windows, where Taylor's narrator is addicted to the if only, you could also take the principles of my So High School reading from Chapter 4 and apply them here. I Hate It Here is, after all, a song about staging great escapes in your head to cope with an unbearable reality, whereas I Look in People's Windows is about searching in vain for a similar fantasy here on Earth. Although Thank You, Amy ends with Taylor's narrator metaphorically driving away, it is also this very same brand of intentionally childish narrative spinning that has gotten Taylor into trouble throughout the rest of the album. While I don't doubt that Taylor has healed quite a lot and just enjoys getting her licks in, if we read the song Cassandra as being about 2018, especially its motif of a crack in the wall that is always able to stop the narrator in her tracks and make her lose her language even after it's been patched up, then we can see how the getaway car in Thank You, Amy still has the small town in its rearview mirror like a pair of obnoxious LED lights. I can go anywhere I want, just not home. Later, though, in The Bolter, the protagonist realizes that the consolation prizes of her romantic mishaps are the stories themselves, and, in the same verse, finally connects her childhood trauma to the cycle she's been repeating. If you recall Pete Walker's idea of an emotional flashback being the hallmark symptom of PTSD, The Bolter's constant emphasis on how fleeing from relationships reminds its protagonist of her near-death experience is literally just satirizing this concept without even naming it. Despite this, ending the song with Then Came Out Alive draws our attention to her continued survival of her trauma and of the cycle it's caused. The anthology's penultimate song, Robin, then, is where the cycle-breaking work comes to a head. Although Robin admits to constructing a narrative to keep his titular character in sweetness, its strings tied to levers and slowed down clocks are immediately revealed as showmanship, the theater of adults for the benefit of children. As is usually the case with child characters, the literary child of Robin is a vehicle for the adult narrator's fantasies, fears, and desires around childhood. However, rather than trying to return to childhood, as Taylor has attempted to use others to do throughout the album, Taylor steps into one of the ultimate roles of an adult, and in doing so, vows to keep a secret rather than be the secret that's kept. Back in the age of the Red Muse, she wished she was 30, and when that fantasy was ruined, she attempted to find solace in the trappings of a girlhood that, per would've, could've, should've, had already been taken from her. This time, though, she truly understands there's no going back. The time will arrive for the cruel and the mean. However, where she once bemoaned on midnights how everybody expects me to bounce back just like that, she now assures her child muse that they'll learn to bounce back much more easily. Thus, the pain of the lost childhood is now channeled into productive, pro-social activities, into breaking the cycle by preventing its repetition in future generations, rather than in trying to escape what's already been done to you. In the manuscript, the question of what the agony had been for has an obvious answer in the art that was produced from it. But given Robin's proximity to the manuscript, perhaps the agony's payoff is also in the personal growth necessary to fully participate in and cherish the community you've built around yourself. Indeed, much research on the actual psychiatric side of things focuses on how to better help patients integrate their traumas into their life stories, with a special focus on writing.
Okay, Mr. Essay, I say, prepare to be written! Now let's see how it looks so far.
Psychologists like James W. Pennybacher, who has spent most of the last 40 years researching expressive writing, found all the way back in the late 80s that writing about your traumatic experiences for as little as 15 minutes a day can create marked improvement to not just your mental, but your physical health. The setup for his initial study was Pennybacher separating students in his writing lab into two groups, one of which was asked to write about some random bullshit every day in class, and the other of which was asked to write about something traumatic in their life. No matter the group, the writing was to be continuous, without regard to spelling, grammar, or sentence structure. After the study, Pennybacher says, he noticed that students in the latter group went to the doctor less, which intrigued him. While it's tempting to write this off with a joke about the cost of American healthcare, his research has been replicated hundreds of times, with a meta-analysis of 146 studies finding small but statistically significant positive effects on everything from psychological problems like depression to immune function and immune-related variables, which can include anything from your body's response to the herpes virus to your liver function to your HIV viral load. It's fucking crazy. Further variations in his initial experiment, including allowing some test groups to use nonverbal expressions like dance, found that simply expressing your feelings was not enough to achieve long-term health benefits. You had to start organizing those feelings into a story. Specifically, Pennybacher and his co-author write, people whose health improved, who got higher grades, and who found jobs after writing went from using relatively few causal and insight words to using a high rate of them by the last day of writing. Another study based on his had participants write about an imaginary trauma rather than one of their own, which produced comparable health results to the group writing pure autobiography. It's worth lingering here to note that, despite these methods being helpful to a wide array of different groups, other replications have shown little to no benefit to people like those diagnosed with PTSD, or older adults who have been recently bereaved. Pennybacher also observed that many of the students in the trauma group would, pretty reasonably, get quite upset during the actual writing, even though they reported feeling better in the long run. So if you don't currently have other tools for re-regulating yourself, I would approach trying this with caution. Pennybacher has an interview with Anna Runkle of Crappy Childhood Fairy where he recommends that people experiment with different forms of writing to find what works for them. To give an example, he describes one experience of writing in the air with his finger, which is something I hadn't even thought of before. Indeed, going back to the idea that you don't even need to be fully writing about yourself, I was introduced to Pennybacher's work by the article Fictionalizing Pain, Processing Grief Through Fiction Writing by Angela Matthews, wherein she describes how writing about herself in the third person through semi-autobiographical fiction helped create the mental space necessary to grieve the death of her child. As she writes, moving through what Strobe and Scott, 1999, termed the dual process model of grieving, I coped with grief by moving back and forth between confronting and avoiding my son's death. Back and forth, I confronted the loss by writing about it, but also escaped into a fictional realm for a while to forget, and then eventually write more. Write and confront, escape and forget. Write and confront, escape and forget. My son's death brought far too much pain to accept all at once. Sometimes I needed to escape thoughts of Taylor and escape thoughts of a future without him. Fiction writing helped me through that process. It seemed to serve as a bridge for me to slowly withdraw from the past with him to the present and a future without him. Before I began to transform my journal entries into fiction, there are certain specific memories that I refused to write or talk about. I either avoided them or wrote simplistic, undetailed accounts of what happened. Following the advice of Pennybacher and Evans 2014 to use third-person POV helps me approach these painful scenes. Using pseudonyms and composite characters instead of my family further liberated me from my hesitance to remember and start thinking about the unthinkable. Crafting those scenes as fiction allowed my heart the distance to reflect on those most horrible moments, but gave me the presence of mind to acknowledge my traumatic experiences and position them in relation to the larger world of traumatic loss, not just my own. In a different article, Matthews also describes turning to autoethnography, an anthropological approach which focuses on the intersections of personal experiences and the culture in which those experiences take place. Alongside her fiction writing, Matthews found that the process of reading and emulating other autoethnographers was a step towards rebuilding my life. It demanded so much more of me than staring out windows, my primary activity for so long after Taylor's death. Learning autoethnography meant reading, thinking, and applying abstract ideas to develop my writing, something my zombie self had not accomplished in a long time. This method not only turns the traumatic event into raw material for study, but takes literally Pennybacher's interview comment about the importance of being your own scientist. I can also vouch for this method, as one of my favorite genres to write is fragmented creative nonfiction, which allows for the weaving of short memoir segments in with art and cultural criticism, turning the traumatic events not only into jumping off points for research, but pieces in a literary puzzle I've invented for myself.
there is not one true way with expressive writing, and what might work for you might not work for other people. And by the same token, something that works for you right now might not work for you next time. And experiment, see what works for you. And, start measuring things. For example, how well are you sleeping? What's your resting heart rate? Are you drinking more? Are you drinking less? Are you talking about it too much? Are you ruminating it more about it more or less? And just do these little experiments every day, trying to find out what works best for you.
Now, I've always been a writer, but something else I discovered within the last year when a family member was hospitalized was writing letters. I have a complicated relationship with this person, so this was often very triggering for me, but something I discovered was that late at night, when I couldn't sleep because of my intrusive thoughts, I could essentially drown them out by imagining what I would write in my next letter. I would also find poems I thought this person would like and print them out, as well as cool stickers because I knew they liked journaling. It turned into this neat little ritual that moved my mind not only towards trying to understand and narrativize my trauma, but to engaging with new art and repairing my relationship with this person. The point I'm trying to get at here is that where trauma destroys our well-tread paths to our communities and to ourselves, writing can turn this destruction into opportunities to create entirely new roads, and to a process of near infinite self-expansion when we have once been made to feel so small. When this video is supposed to be about Taylor Swift, oh right. Going back to Robin, of course she isn't telling any of this to the actual Robin, at least as far as we know. This little dissonance draws our attention to the last crucial elements in rewriting one's traumatic past. Who's listening? As Candace stated earlier, the last level of a traumatic text, the last component that must work in unison with others to create a functioning circuit, is the listener. Doria Laub would concur that bearing witness to trauma is in fact a process that includes the listener, adding that the exorcism of a traumatic memory can only occur when one can articulate and transmit the story, literally transfer it to another outside of oneself and then take it back again inside. Breeson sums it up well. The empathetic other is essential to the remaking of the self. Recall again the ending of All Too Well's short film, where Dylan O'Brien's character stands out in the cold as Taylor's proxy reads her novel to a group of female onlookers listening with rapt attention. We, as audience members, are essential to the process of healing, as we, alongside the others in Taylor's personal life of course, provide her with roads back to humanity and thus to selfhood. However, this audience-artist relationship is not without tension. I think this is best reflected in her mashup of Mirrorball and Epiphany on the Eras tour, where Epiphany's assertion that "with you I serve, with you I fall down" is followed up by Taylor's admission that she changes herself constantly to fit in. Her shattered edges glisten from behind plastic. We, the doctors and nurses, hold her hand, but this isn't something med school covered. In other words, Taylor yearns for our attention, but there's a layer of separation fundamentally between us and her, which isn't either party's fault. When I first talked about Epiphany however many thousands of words ago, I mentioned how it and some other incredibly sad songs in Taylor's discography are not talked about because they cannot be made fun. By sheer coincidence, of the 3 songs I'd mentioned, only Epiphany was played on the tour. Although songs like I Can Do It With a Broken Heart reveal that Taylor's feelings about the Eras tour not without nuance, her final song being a mashup of The Manuscript, New Year's Day, and Long Live tells me everything I need to know. The process of songwriting and its final step, performance, connects Taylor to a community of empathetic others. The mashups in the Eras tour, indeed the Eras tour itself, turns these songs, these little boxes of trauma, into Lego pieces, raw materials for expressing new narratives and perspectives. Perhaps most importantly, they also become objects of play. Like with the research stuff I discussed earlier, this play further brings the focus onto the narratives being transmitted and the prowess of Taylor as a storyteller and musician, rather than on the trauma itself. Tortured Poets, like Taylor's other albums, becomes yet another era focused around aesthetic elements and objects like typewriters, monochrome color palettes, and papers flying around the room, things both the artists and fans can play around and have fun with, directing their emotional energy towards themselves and their community instead of just setting it on fire. This is what I think is so genius about calling the final song The Manuscript. Calling the art she's created from her trauma a manuscript gives it a physicality, a life outside of herself. A physical object like a book may exist because of me, but it can exist without me. It can be read in whatever voice the reader wants. I don't have to carry it on my person. By comparison, a Taylor Swift song always contains Taylor as both author and performer. It's her voice after all, and in some songs, even her own heartbeat. But regular old authors, as we all know, are dead until they start getting political on Twitter. In All Too Well, the burden of memory is transferred into the scarf and hangs around her ex-lover's neck like an anchor, whereas in the manuscript, the physical symbol of trauma does not require the participation of the abuser to have its power. There is closure in closing the book yourself. Escape and escaping without regard for how the other person feels, if they regret how they treated you, if they wonder if they could have done better. Taylor's own words support this, as she states in the Reputation Stadium tour.
You turned this song into a collage of memories of watching you scream the words to this song, or seeing pictures that you post to me of you having written the words to this song in your diary, or you showing me your wrist and you have a tattoo of the lyrics to this song underneath your skin, and that is how you have changed the song All Too Well for me.
Even when not fun in the traditional sense, performances of emotional songs like Marjorie essentially become a grief ritual, as both audience and performer are given space to connect with their feelings of grief in a safe, supportive environment. I Know Better, But I Still Feel You All Around, as Marjorie's own voice fills the stadium, offers another hopeful example of absence moving back into presence, as the dead remain active players through our memories of them, through our integration of their life lessons into our life stories. What happens to a ghost when you embrace it? In most stories, the happy ending is the ghost being laid to rest, that is, going away. But not all ghosts are like that. What do you do with the ghosts that want to garden with you, that want to slip into your bed, that want to lurk in the back of the fridge with all your once favorite foods? All this to say that where Taylor goes from here narratively is anyone's guess. Her outfit at the recent Grammys provides a huge hint, as her bright red... So, just 2 days after I started editing the video component of Chapter 5, Taylor posted a letter on her website stating that she had purchased the Masters Tour's first 6 albums, as well as all their related content like unreleased songs, photo shoots, concert films, etc., etc. One of my first reactions, other than to run around my house blasting Sasha Banks' old theme, Sky's the Limit, was to tweet about Taylor's last Grammys outfit, as the fandom had been very quick to speculate that the earrings and thigh chain, each made with 12 rubies, were a reference to the Rubies That I Gave Up line from Maroon. In my original script, I wrote that I suspect that TS12 will be a rebuild album, similar to how Lover is the rebuild album after Reputation. Given this latest reveal, I now consider this theory confirmed. I'm not going to comment on all the current TS12 theories since this video is already a million years long, but there is one other thing I want to bring up. The account Taylor Swift Updates alleges that the photographs Taylor used to announce buying her masters were taken back in March, which coincidentally is the same date that Taylor Nation posted an edit of Taylor's childhood home video set to the song Robin. I feel pretty confident predicting that TS12 will in some way engage with this inner child, hopefully meeting her at her level with fresh grace, compassion, and wisdom. Taylor's already begun exploring this theme on songs like The Manuscript, which offers a kind of cold hope in its resolution. The hopeful orchestral swell of the bridge gives way to sparse piano keys again, as Taylor moves herself from a fictionalized third-person character who merely reacts to others, to a first-person acting I, the child self growing up and meeting with the current self at last, opening the possibility of an adulthood with bruises so faded that you don't even notice they're there. Most of the time, anyway. How's that one song on Lover go, the one Taylor was originally going to name the whole album after?
Gotta step into the daylight. Let it go. Let it go. Let it go. And I just wanted you to know this is me trying to let it go. Let it go.
Of course, that the first autobiographical album after Lover was called Midnights only highlights how the stories we tell ourselves can be outgrown. This is what I meant earlier by cold hope. The prospect of reinvention is terrifying and is total freedom, but being the subject of one's own speech means that we can call our ghosts whatever we like. We can even call them our friends. As Florence remarks in the song Florida, "Yeah, I'm haunted, but I'm feeling just fine." And even if we don't, a life with ghosts is still a life. Ghosts don't actually fill our spaces, even when it seems like they do, so we can always grab a chair so they can sit with us, or create new photos for them to look at, instead of searching every old one for a reflection. If there's anything to take from all this, it's that the wound may not always stay closed. Sure, the shape of us may be made jagged and weak again, but rest assured, dear reader, it can be stitched back up, and we can embroider it with new meanings that allow us to come back out and enjoy the sun. Take care out there, and remember, All's fair in love and poetry. Sincerely, the unfunded PhD candidate of the Tortured Poets Department. If you've made it this far, I just want to say thank you. I really appreciate you all giving me your time and attention. Since I know Swifties love spending money, I've set up a Ko-Fi if you feel like sending me a tip. Totally optional, but of course I would appreciate it. I also want to thank several people for their help throughout this project. Aside from the people named in the video, I want to also thank Twitter users Comment in the Sky for alerting me to their Red Poem and Taylor's DGA event. Tayissa Turners for showing me E.R. Dobbs' book and proofreading the statue worship section of chapter 5, and Tay Narcotics for providing feedback on this essay as I was editing. Always Wonderler and SackCore18 also provided lots of encouragement as I was writing the essays that eventually became this video script. My brother also wanted to be credited as a racism consultant, so there you have it. Alright, on to the rest of the credits.